It's time for another Friday update with your old pal Millennial Moron. I've only got two stories for you this week, but they're both bangers. And I know bangers. I don't normally like to ask you to watch to the end, but the Bank of Canada stuff this week is one of the strangest things I've uncovered in my research, so this week is a good one to go the distance. First, let's do the one that everybody keeps DMing me about, the cap on student visas. On Monday, the government announced they'd be putting a 2-year cap on new student visas with a target of 360,000 for 2024, a decrease of about 35% from 2023, bringing us back to roughly the level we had in 2018. This is an abrupt change in messaging from just 3 months ago when Immigration Minister Mark Miller said that a cap on student visas wasn't in the cards, and that imposing a cap would be like doing surgery with a hammer. As far as the opposition goes, as recently as January 12th, Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre refused to answer questions about whether he'd be willing to put a cap on student visas. After the government announcement on Monday, I guessed that he would suddenly start saying that not only would he impose a cap, he would have done it way sooner. Of course, he followed through and said more or less exactly that in a press conference the same day.
Do you believe it's the right move for the federal government to cap the number of international students arriving in Canada for the next 2 years? And would you do the same?
Yes. The question is, how do we get into this mess? You know, most Canadians didn't even know there was an international student program 8 years ago because it was so peaceful. And then along came Justin Trudeau. He is to blame. He is the one that caused this mess. He is the one that brought hundreds of thousands of people here without homes.
Keep in mind, the two parties have always been more or less aligned on immigration targets, and up until now, neither of them has seriously discussed the idea of establishing any kind of limit on non-permanent residents. In fact, they've both worked together to continually increase the number without limit and to allow international students to become a larger and larger factor in our labor force. In 2006, the newly elected Conservatives introduced a work permit for international students that would allow them to work off-campus for 20 hours a week. Then in 2014, they allowed full-time students in an academic program lasting at least 6 months to work off-campus for 20 hours a week by default rather than having to apply for an additional permit. Also in 2014, they set a target of doubling the number of international students by 2022. And even back then, they were citing labor shortages as a driving factor. Then, in 2022, when the Liberals removed the cap on work hours for international students, which is more or less a completely opposite policy to putting a cap on new study permits, the Conservative immigration critic, who was appointed by Poilievre, also said that it was a common-sense move and that the Conservatives would have done that sooner than the Liberals. Meanwhile, Mark Miller is now saying that allowing full-time work on a student visa gives people a reason to come to Canada on a study permit for reasons other than studying, but that a return to a 20-hour limit would be on the draconian end of the spectrum. He blames the college system for the whole mess, despite the fact that unlimited work hours is their own policy. This is just me talking, but when you put all that together, it seems like neither of these parties have any actual principles or opinions on how the system should work, and they're just responding to public sentiment as it comes up. So maybe, instead of our discussions being about Liberals versus Conservatives, we should be talking about solutions and policy options that we can actually agree on, and then encourage whatever government is in power to do that. But hey, what do I know? Anyway, speaking of colleges, one of the more interesting things in this announcement is that people studying through a curriculum leasing program will no longer be eligible for a post-graduation work permit. Now, you're probably asking, what even is curriculum leasing? Alex Usher from Higher Education Strategy wrote a great overview of these programs. Basically, curriculum licensing is a public-private partnership where a public college partners with a private college to deliver their accredited public curriculum for international students at the private campus. These were very popular in Ontario, where colleges outside the GTA wanted to get in on the cash cow of international student tuition, but they knew that most international students would be moving to the GTA, so they leased their curriculum to small private colleges in the GTA without actually having the students physically present at their main campus. The private college does the actual teaching, while the public college takes care of the student visa, issues the diploma, and collects a fee for not really doing anything. Because the public colleges are bringing in more money, the province can cut college funding without the colleges going bankrupt. Everybody wins, except for, the students and I guess the general public as well. Interestingly, back in 2017, a consultant named David Trick wrote a report on these public-private partnerships for the Ontario government. In the report, he said that they basically have no oversight or quality control and should be shut down as soon as possible. As a result of the report, the government at the time put a moratorium on these partnerships with the eventual goal of eliminating them entirely. However, in 2019, the new Ontario government announced that the 2017 report was a bunch of nonsense and we should have all the public-private partnerships we can handle. Anyway, the government predicts that the student visa cap will result in as much as a 50% drop in international students in Ontario, so expect news stories to start popping up in the next year or two about how Ontario colleges are facing a budget crisis. Next, the Bank of Canada continued with their interest rate pause on Wednesday in a move that surprised absolutely no one. However, they also released their quarterly monetary policy report, and something I noticed was that they pushed back the projection for inflation returning to the 2% target to 2025. This caught my interest because it seems like they're always predicting that inflation will return to the target about 1.5 to 2 years from now. This is something I've been thinking about since seeing this chart of how the bank's inflation projections were repeatedly updated over the past few years, with the model seeming to be mean reverting, meaning that the projections will always return to the long-term average. Looking at the way these projections have evolved and looking back at the old monetary policy reports, there's a very obvious trend that when inflation was rising rapidly, the bank was always predicting that it was about to peak next quarter before starting to drop back down towards the target. Obviously, that didn't pan out, and inflation shot up to 8% before the bank finally started hiking interest rates. There was also a good article in the Globe and Mail about how the Bank of Canada is overhauling their core economic forecasting models. So I decided to do a little digging into some technical papers about one of the two core models that they use currently, which is called the Terms of Trade Economic Model, or TOTEM, and this is another one of those situations where I like to say, the more you know, the worse it gets. One thing that caught my eye in this 2006 paper on the first generation of TOTEM is that because of the way parameters are set up in the model, inflation tends to return to the target value quickly, usually in a year and a half, or 6 quarters, as economists like to say. This paper is about the first generation of TOTEM, and we're currently on the third generation, but it seems like these parameters are still baked into the model. This was very interesting to me because when I look through the Bank of Canada's monetary policy reports from the last few years, you pretty much always see them predicting that inflation will return to the target in about 6 to 8 quarters. This is true in the latest report they released on Wednesday, but it was also true in April of 2021 when inflation was first starting to rise. But again, they projected that it would return to the target in a year and a half to 2 years, even if the bank kept interest rates at rock bottom. Then, as I mentioned earlier, when inflation was rising rapidly, they always projected that inflation was about to peak next quarter before sinking back down to the target rate. This makes me suspect that the model has a strong tendency to revert to the target inflation rate regardless of what's going on in the economy. In fact, in this 2023 paper discussing the need for an updated model, they mentioned that rule of thumb price setters in the model, which are basically businesses that set prices or wages depending on what has happened in the past rather than what they expect in the future, set their price increases based on the bank's inflation target. So when you run the model, of course the results naturally drift closer and closer towards the inflation target. There's a similar situation in our other core economic model called LENS, where inflation expectations are weighted towards the bank's inflation target. As a real-life equivalent, a rule-of-thumb price setter would be like a grocery company looking at what's happening and saying, well, I know inflation is high and we could raise prices a lot if we want to, but gosh darn it, the target is 2%, so we're only going to raise our prices by 2% and give up some of our profits to help the bank achieve their macroeconomic goals. How realistic does that sound to you? I don't think it seems right, but it's a major component of how the current models work. In terms of mathematical modeling, this kind of thing is what I refer to as cranking the dials. You're changing parameters or introducing fictitious elements to try to get your model to match what's happened in the past, but really you should be trying to fill those gaps in your model with things that exist in real life. Papering over the problems with fictional elements might look nice in a paper or a presentation, but you don't get predictive capability out of that, just a model that can tell you what's already happened. This is kind of concerning to me because these projections seem like they were an important part of the bank's justification for waiting so long to raise rates, even as inflation was clearly getting out of control. And as of right now, there's a lot of economic hopes riding on rates dropping this year, which is largely based on the bank's expectation that inflation will be returning to the target rate in about 6 quarters. The problem is, if the model almost always predicts we're going to hit our inflation target rate in 6 to 8 quarters, we're kind of flying blind on our interest rate projections. And just to remind you again, this forecasting is a significant part of how we determine monetary policy for the entire fucking country. Now, I don't want to slander the entire field of economics, but I'm just saying, if economics were planes, trains, or automobiles, we'd all be dead. Anyway, that's all for this week, so as always, thanks for watching and enjoy your weekend.
Hey buddy, say hi. Everyone always has to see you.